Welcome to you, Abi Adams-Prassl, and welcome to you, Jeremias Adams-Prassl. It's my big pleasure to have you with us here today in this Ars Boni session. Both of you are well-known researchers in your field, and both of you are uniquely well-known researchers for one peculiar reason for which I admire you both a lot. Both of you are ERC grant holders, and this is such a rare species that one feels very privileged in meeting one of them. But in this case, I even meet two of them, which is really outstanding. And I admire you and I congratulate you most warmly for this really, really impressive achievement. Abi, to start with you first, Abi is Associate Professor and Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. Her background is economics, in particular behavioral economics, and she is, among many other things that are most interesting, the co-founder of the Covid-19 Inequality project, which is a project dealing with the economic impact of the crisis and the differences in the economic impact in different societies and with different stakeholders. Very, very pleased to have you with us. And Jeremias is a lawyer from his background. He also works at the University of Oxford as a professor of law. His expertise is mainly in, but not only, in European and in labor law. I had the privilege to meet him at several occasions. One of them, he was one of the most impressive speakers I ever met at the University of Vienna when it came to platform economical issues and labor law. And we also met in Alpbach. Alpbach is one of the, I don't know, think tanks or summer university events the Austrians might know, where Jeremias gave a seminar on his topics, which is, as I said, mainly European and labor law in the platform economy. I most warmly recommend to you his book, Humans as a Service. I also had the privilege to talk with him already about this book about 2 years ago, so prior to the crisis. But many of the points that Jeremias writes about in this book are more evident now than they might have been in 2018. So thank you for being here. I'm happy to tell you that we also have some people who followed us to this strange environment here already. So some of you are live here. I'm a little bit relieved about this. Let me start with you, Abi. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about this specific focus on COVID and inequality in your research and what the major outcomes are so far? And perhaps also a little bit about how you think that the law should react on your outcomes, as far as you can tell.
That's a great question, and yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. So together with colleagues at the University of Cambridge and the University of Zurich, starting in mid-March last year, so just as the first lockdowns were starting to be introduced across Europe, we ended up running a series of surveys, really trying to understand what the labour market impacts of the COVID-19 crisis were. So trying to understand which types of workers were most affected, how was policy helping this or hindering it, and also to what degrees were different countries able to kind of smooth this shock in different ways. And I guess just to give you, we ran 3 surveys over the summer. We're now just gearing up for a new round of surveys. So yeah, there'll be kind of more results out in the next kind of month or so. But in terms of what we found last year, I think the key things are that across countries, the labour market impacts of COVID-19 have been very different, especially at the beginning of the crisis, in terms of how do the lockdowns and social distancing affect income workers across the income distribution differently. So we see that that workers in Germany were much better protected by the state response than in the US and the UK. Another key dimension that we've been really interested in is the gender impacts of this crisis. So if you compare the recession that we've been living through over the past year to those in the past, this recession has very different characteristics, both in terms of the sectors and the occupations that have been hit, but also, of course, how this is not just an economic crisis, it's spilled over into how we live our, into domestic life. That kind of school closures, disruption to childcare have had a huge impact on families, and the degree to which men and women with children especially can work. And so starting in September last year, I've been a special advisor to the UK Parliament Select Committee on Women Inequalities, trying to understand a little bit more about how are the different policies that have been put in place hindered, perhaps, or have they accentuated gender inequalities, or have they helped to mitigate them? We'll be putting our report out next week. So I guess that's kind of the background to the work that we found, the work I've been doing. Mm-hmm. I'll let Jeremias talk potentially more about the law, but I think that just in terms of one thing I'll say at this point, what we've seen in terms of especially the dimensions of inequality in the US and the UK keep coming back to the fact that workers who were less protected, in terms of who was most affected in the US and the UK labour markets, a lot of it was entirely predictable, given the fragmentation and the inequality which existed prior to COVID-19 hitting. So a lot of what's happened is an accentuation of existing inequalities, especially around labour protection. So individuals on temporary 0 hours contracts, and those who were self-employed, especially the so-called solo self-employed or the sham self-employed, so think gig economy, think self-employed people who aren't employing other workers, they'd be most likely to be badly affected, and at least in the UK I can say this, the most likely to fall through the gaps in the government response systems to this, as they don't qualify for furlough often, and often they also miss out for self-employment income support schemes. Mm-hmm. Again, I'll leave this to Jeremias in more depth, but I also think that this is not just a crisis now. Some of the trends that we're seeing now are going to persist into the future. And I think that means that there's a lot of things that labour lawyers need to grapple with and getting on there early in terms of working from home, in terms of employment protection, and also in terms of how we think about the regulation of flexible work are going to be really key coming out of this.
Yeah, but before we start talking about the law, perhaps one more question about the empirical basis. As far as I understand the situation, you are comparing the US, the UK, and Germany in particular.
Yeah.
Why these three, and what are the most significant differences? In particular, I would be very interested to compare the German with the UK situation, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So these are the three countries that the team had pre-existing links to. So that I think is the honest answer, I guess. Mm-hmm. I think it's also quite interesting because even if we think about the kind of the flagship employment response, which has been it's called the furlough scheme, or the coronavirus job retention scheme in the UK, which is a little bit like Kurzarbeit in Germany. Mm-hmm. And then in the US, instead what we had was so-called recall unemployment scheme. So rather than a short-time work scheme, what in the US the policy was that individuals who would have the equivalent, they would have been put on short-time work in Europe. Mm-hmm. In the US, they became unemployed, but were able to it was kind of like it's called recall unemployment. It's kind of this funny scheme, but basically you have this let go, more workers will let go in the US. Mm-hmm. And so I think understanding, especially as I say, one of the focuses I've been looking at is the gender dimension. Mm-hmm. There you really do see big differences. So in the UK, the US especially, the differences in job loss between men and women have been massive.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what we find in Germany is something much more muted.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think as well, if we think that in the UK now, our system is not of short-time work scheme is not as well established as Kurzarbeit, but we've moved much closer to that system over the crisis. And again, what we were seeing at the beginning of the crisis was a much greater impact and differentiation by men and women, and that has become slightly different as more, as basically these short-time work schemes have been able to kind of smooth over some of these difficulties that men and women have been having. The final thing I'll say on this is also just in terms of if we think about the system of employment protection that we have in these different countries, and how especially how self-employment fits into this. So we do see in all countries that workers are not in a standard employment relationship, so be that temporary, be that with variable hours that workers don't control, or be that in a kind of a vulnerable self-employment relationship. We find in all countries that workers in more vulnerable situations have been more likely to lose income and face kind of hours losses. However, what we also see is that the extent of those losses is just much less in Germany than in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and that's something as well that you saw during the financial crisis as well.
Yeah, and why is this? Is this because of the differences in the legal system, or is it more because of the social involvement of the relevant parts of the population, or is this not part of your research and it still needs to be done?
So a lot of what I do is empirical, and it's often really difficult to come to like a precise answer about what are the precise factors empirically which are really important here. All I can say is that the work that I've done shows that timing has really mattered in this crisis. The fact that Kurzarbeit, in the German labour market, there were a lot of schemes which were up and ready to go instantly, I think really helped to smooth that shock, right, at the beginning of last year, which has had consequences then throughout the crisis. In the UK, it took us a lot longer to get our short-time work scheme up and running. And then the precise design of that scheme, to be honest, was quite awful at the beginning. I mean, it was better than nothing, but you weren't allowed, compared to Kurzarbeit, workers in the UK, either you had to be working your full normal hours for your employer or nothing at all. Now that led to some very strange behavior, to be honest, both by employers, by workers. Luckily now that's not the case. We are able to have more flexible reductions in hours now, but it took until July for that to happen.
And is there any political debate in the UK happening on this at the moment? So if your figures are debated in public, do people care about that, or is it just some kind of background noise for the really important things happening in politics? Or how would you assess this?
I mean, so there's a big discussion going on right now about our furloughs. Our short-time work scheme is due to end in April. So we've had this continual system as well, because we don't have this established scheme. There's a continual, when is it going to end? When is it going to end? When is it going to end? Which really does create a huge amount of uncertainty for firms about how to plan and to what degree can they keep workers on. So it's very much a live issue right now. So the key, if you like, kind of economics that's going on in the debate at the moment is if social distancing and lockdowns are going to be part of our lives for still at least the short term, maybe the medium term. Actually, are we just preventing through subsidizing, workers staying with firms which can't operate under social distancing? Are we just delaying the inevitable pain? and therefore spending lots of money on just keeping people in these almost zombie firms. And actually, wouldn't it just be better for people to start moving to firms which are viable in a social distancing type world? On the other hand, of course, that knocks out a huge amount of hospitality of sales in the service sector, which disproportionately employ those on lower incomes, women, and migrants. So like those at the bottom of society. So I think it's, and are you just going to let the whole of hospitality just kind of go by the wayside for a couple of, for a year? It's unclear, like, as well, the degree of like how long term those costs will end up being. The other thing which is a big debate at the moment is the degree to which our benefit system in the UK needs to be updated to reflect what's going on. So basically, since 2010 with austerity, we've had a series of shifts in the way that our social security system works, such that, to quote people giving evidence to the UK Parliament Select Committees, our benefit system is at its bare bones. And we've had, again, these ad hoc top-ups, this £20 a week top-up through the crisis up until right now. And the question is, okay, so what's going to happen with that going forward? Is that going to become permanent? Is it not? Especially if what they do is they end furlough, and lots of people who have been on 80% of their salaries whilst not working for almost a year now move on to our benefit system. That's going to be a huge income shock for a lot of people. So the key, I think, thing which is going on in politicians' mind at the moment is, it's really just trying to guess, like we all are, how long is this going on, and to what degree is this the new normal versus something where we can slowly transition into normal times again in a few months.
And it's very hard to tell, right? I mean,
I've given up trying to predict at this point.
Yeah, but does that have any impact? I mean, the uncertainty in which all of us are at the moment, does that have any impact on the planning of your research in this field? So how do you deal personally with this at the moment? Is it, That's
such a good question, because we designed our next set of surveys to go. They were supposed to be going out last October and November, but the way that the funding agency had wanted it was that some of the surveys were in recovery time. So we ended up putting off the ones in November, because we're definitely not in a recovery now. We're about to go into lockdown again. But of course, we've got to this point and it's like, okay, we're still in lockdown. I think we just need to start running surveys again. So no, it has impacted quite a lot.
I think all of us are fighting with these issues at the moment when we do research in this field. But Jeremias, I mean, a lot of what we have been talking about so far does have an impact on the legislative system, obviously, and on the way how lawyers deal with the situation. Let us perhaps start with a brief description where you come from, Jeremias. So perhaps the starting point of your picture that you see when you look on the COVID-19 crisis, I would assume is one which is very heavily influenced by this, I mentioned it already, terrific book, Humans as a Service, which deals with in how far the labor market has changed in the last years because of these platforms and similar developments coming with digitalization and the internet. So what was the starting point, and where do we stand from your perspective today?
Thank you, Nicholas. And I think there's one sort of a logic thing that comes out of the work on the gig economy, and one thing that's quite counterintuitive. So I think the background to thinking about the gig economy was that there was always this narrative that technology and digitalization would lead to completely new labor market structures. This idea that, using platforms to intermediate work would somehow create an entirely new future of work, a new model of organizing the labor market. The reality is that the kind of trends that we see in the gig economy have been going on for 10, 20, 30 years. The sort of taking of the traditional relationship between an employer, her workers and the customers, and the sort of fragmenting and breaking that up into individual tasks is something we've seen for decades. So you see this through labor outsourcing, you see this through various corporate chains, you see this through instantiations of fixed term or part-time work. And so one thing that was always really interesting about the gig economy was that even though the technology was new, the kind of labor market challenges we saw weren't particularly novel. In a sense, they were sort of, sexier, and suddenly people, nobody was interested in talks about agency labor, but suddenly people were interested in talks about Uber and Deliveroo and Foodora. But the underlying labor market challenges were the same. And I think if you sort of had to bring, as it were, the labor market and the economics together, what had been happening in the labor market is that we'd seen a massive shift of risk. We've seen a massive shift of risks that's always inherent in the market from employers, from the market in general, to the individual employee, right? So you think about this, if I run a beautiful cafe in Vienna, I've got a risk every morning whether people will turn up or not. I need to choose whether I am going to have staff-ins, just sitting around waiting there, and then have to pay them. And so what we saw through the gig economy was an acceleration of various trends where we try and shift that business risk onto the individual. Right. So rather than running a cafe, I could then say, well, I'm just a coffee and cake platform, and each individual worker can come in, and then, if somebody orders something, she can go and complete that kind of job. Now, what that ends up doing in the short term is it ends up saving costs for employers, because it means that, those downtimes, you no longer have to pay for that. You only pay the individual as and when they're actually immediately economically active. The real problem that lurks underneath this is that individuals can't really diversify their risk portfolio, right? So what ends up happening, imagine if I'm an employer, big taxi company with lots of taxis, well, if any one driver has got a passenger at the moment, it doesn't really matter to me, because overall, if I have 100 taxis, some will be in business, others won't, and everything comes out in the wash. As an individual worker, it's extremely hard for myself to diversify that risk. Right? I can't really sort of be an Uber driver and do some teaching and maybe be on another platform at the same time. Yeah, it doesn't really work. And so I think what we saw was just this immense concentration of risk on the individual. And that's when things start to break down, right? And so we get to February, March of 2020, and we have a labor market where more and more risk is concentrated on the individual. And that is where it creates the perfect storm for when COVID hits.
And do you see any differences in the storm in the UK in comparison, for example, with Austria that are important, or Germany that are important here and that need our specific attention?
So yes, I think we did see some pretty big differences. I think even within countries, and I think this is really important, we see a huge difference in terms of what the impact of COVID is, right? And so this is where the point, Abi talks about the inequality of COVID, and I'm pretty sure she would agree that actually we're not just talking about one dimension of inequality, we're actually talking about a vast number of different dimensions of inequality. And so one of the most interesting graphs that I think came out very early from Abi's work was that the impact COVID had on you was very much driven by the kind of riskiness of your setup. It wasn't actually the legal categorization that made a big difference, whether you were an employee or were you self-employed. The big difference was whether you had guaranteed permanent working hours or whether you were in some sort of flexible work arrangement. And so I think then we need to start splitting up the conversation into two different dimensions. I think the first conversation we need to have is about people on these flexible work arrangements. And people usually in low wage incomes. And then the second legal challenge we want to think about is people in more traditional, standard, well remunerated work. Because I think, Abi, you'll be able to tell us the exact numbers, but there was a near perfect correlation between how much you earn and whether you could work from home or not, right? Was it somewhere around 25,000 euros or dollars or pounds that the cutoff lay?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the precise correlation, but absolutely. There's a striking correlation between income and working from home. So if you earn in the UK, like over £50,000, you can do almost all of your work from home. If you're in the bottom, if you're in the bottom segment by earnings of the labour market, you can do almost none of your job from home.
Yeah, but isn't that obvious? Because the more you earn, the more you need your brain, and the less you depend on infrastructure for your work. So I mean, infrastructure provided by the employer then. I mean, if I'm a taxi driver earning little money, it's obvious that I need my car. But if I'm a university professor, it's not that obvious that I need my office. So I mean, it's interesting, but I think it's quite evident, isn't it?
It is quite evident, I think.
Yeah.
But if you still think of things like call center work, there are various forms of low-skilled work which are relatively amenable to working from home, but they tend to be concentrated actually, in more like kind of middle-income jobs.
Yeah.
Something which is slightly different, actually, let's go against a bit what you just said, is that what we've seen over the crisis is, of course, that all of us have realised that we could do more of our jobs from home than we could at the beginning. Part of that is learning. Part of that is investments that we as workers have made in terms of better lighting, a better home office setup, potentially not even subsidised by our employers. The other thing is that employers have also done a lot to think about how do they move to a world of remote work and non-co-located workers and monitorers. And so one of the other things that we've seen a lot of over the crisis is greater investment in more monitoring technologies and more kind of scheduling technologies to better facilitate working from home for a much wider group of workers than was able to work from home at the beginning of the crisis.
So I still wonder, Jeremias, if I may come back to you about this risk point. I may say I find this very convincing, obviously, that this shift of risks has happened and that it's still ongoing. But I would also like to stress the point that when we look into the labor law debate, at least in a country like Austria at the moment, since March, one of the most evident points that are intensely debated is who is going to take the risk if I have an accident in my home office, right? So the Unfallversicherung as a problem, which is, in my view, one of the very, very many, very how would I say, very not really complex enough attempts to understand the situation in which we are, right? So isn't it just, it's not only the risk, it's also the complete failure of the legal system to take care of what really the risks are, and which is not really a risk at all any longer.
Absolutely.
Would you agree? Yeah.
And actually, just before we get to the home office dangers, let me just quickly finish with the risk and the sort of the public health perspective. Let's just finish off on the bottom of the labour market perhaps first. Yeah. Because one of the things we saw is that what happens as that risk shift, if you concentrate too much risk on an entity that can't actually bear it, you end up externalizing it. Right. Yeah. And so actually what ended up happening is that you created all sorts of perverse incentives for self-employed people in very flexible jobs that if you were a food delivery courier, for example, even if you were feeling sick, you didn't have legal protection, right? You couldn't actually just be at home and still get paid. So you created early on this system where actually, because nobody could afford to stay at home, even if you were feeling sick, you ended up having to go to work and spreading the virus. Right. So actually, I think this is just an example of how if we concentrate too much of that risk on individuals, we end up creating really perverse incentives within the labor market. And particularly in the public health domain, we saw that really, really strongly.
Yeah.
But sorry, go on.
No, sorry, just one. So that means, I mean, one request from your perspective would be we would really need to get better understanding about the risks, and we need to redistribute them in a more even way, right? Also from a public health point of view, that's the argument, correct? Okay.
Exactly, right. And that's similar to the gig economy argument. It's the way you think about employment protection in a macro level. It's not just about protecting the workers. It's also about consumer protection. It's about creating a level playing field in the market. And there's lots of empirical work done essentially saying that when it comes to trading off risk, the employment relationship is by far the best and also the most efficient way of doing it.
Yeah, and would you help me in assessing in how far the European Union or a country such as Austria or the UK were successful in redistributing this risk prior to COVID? So, I mean, your book was published in 2018, and then we still had 2 years, right? Did anything important happen in this period?
There were a few things. So I can speak a bit about EU labour law. And so there, for example, one attempt you saw in terms of the Commission, in terms of legislation, was the Predictable and Transparent Working Conditions Directive. right? So that was an attempt by the union legislator to actually take some of that risk out, create a bit more in terms of predictability. The reality of the situation, though, is that a lot of it comes down to domestic labor law, and actually the union's regulatory competence in this area is limited, right? So Article 153, paragraph 5 of the TFEU, for example, forbids the union for getting involved in any questions surrounding wage setting, which will be one really important tool. One specific example where I think the Austrian experience, to the limited extent that I'm familiar with this, is superior in terms of its design to what we have in the UK, is that when it comes to tax and social security, self-employment and employment get treated in relatively similar ways. Right? So one big problem we had in the UK before the crisis was that taxes for self-employed were significantly lower than for the employed, which then creates the incentive that in the short term, and as humans, given how time inconsistent we are, we always look to the short term. I might actually be able to earn an extra £1 per hour if I agree with my employer that I'm going to be self-employed, right? Because I'll have lower contributions, both in terms of social security and insurance. And so actually the tax system created this really weird incentive to shove people into self-employment. And it's really interesting that as the UK government has tried for many years to level out those systems, but the political resistance has been too strong. And so when COVID first came in, the UK government introduced a scheme to support furloughed workers, employees. And then very quickly, there was also strong political demand to create a similar system for the self-employed. And the government did indeed introduce such a scheme. And it's really interesting when you watch the video where Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduces the scheme. He says, today, I'm giving protection to the self-employed, but I'm saying this now, when it comes to the next budget, I'm going to start taxing you in the same way I tax the employed. And so in that sense, actually, the UK government at that point did announce the fact that they were going to move to a model that looks much more like the Austrian tax and social security system.
Okay, interesting. So that would be some kind of a positive outcome then, right? So one of the very few positive perspectives. Yeah,
exactly.
Interesting. Interesting.
Well,
go ahead.
Shall we go back to thinking about what happens
absolutely.
Working from home? So now we're shifting, as we were, from the bottom of the labour market to the top of the labour market. And Abi and I, when we were giving talks about this, we used to make everybody do a survey where people could sort of estimate how much of their job they could do from home. And of course, the answer was always, by definition, if you can watch a webinar in the middle of the day, then chances are you can do a lot of your work from home. And let's start with the health and safety points you made, right? So particularly in the UK, I don't know whether that's true in Austria as well, but given the horrible narrow staircases that lots of British houses have, one thing that started happening early on is a massive increase in broken legs and broken ankles as people are sort of working in the home office. And then you get the knock on the door from your Amazon delivery. And as you rush down very quickly, people end up twisting and breaking their ankles, etc. And that then led precisely to that question, sort of less facetiously, that you raised about how do norms apply. And I think that was the biggest challenge we saw, as it were, for more traditional stable jobs. And that is that employment law has essentially grown up around a series of stereotypes of what work looks like. And I think the biggest challenge in terms of the COVID crisis, that the way a lot of the norms are designed was suddenly challenged, right? Because one of the key sort of stereotypes that all of employment regulation was designed about was that we work in an office, that we work in a space that's actually controlled by our employer, and that therefore there are lots of duties imposed on them.
I remember when I worked in Hanover, there was a parking house in Hanover, and there were always two numbers for where cars could park behind each other. And the reason for this was because all the workers came at the same time when the parking house was designed, and therefore it was obvious that you didn't have any problem in leaving because the other guy would also leave at the same time, right? And things have changed significantly since the 50s when this was built, obviously. But isn't that a fundamental problem for the whole labor market law in a way, right? That the tradition of the whole field goes back to the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's evading everywhere. Would you agree with this? And if so, what does that mean for a legal discipline if the empirical factors leading to this discipline evade?
Absolutely. I think we need to be very careful, though, about what the sort of stereotype is, right? So I think one problem that we've already had, and I've written with a colleague at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Einat Albin, about this a bit, is that some stereotypes, for example, where the fact that you had a single employer, that you had a very long-term open-ended relationship, that usually you were a man who was a single breadwinner in the family, who was a member of a trade union, right? And actually, as a result of a lot of these stereotypes, the law ended up creating what colleagues of mine here in Oxford, like Mark Friedland, have called the paradox of precarity, right? So one of the real challenges historically as a result of these stereotypes is that, in a sense, the further you get away from those stereotypes, socioeconomically, the more you will need legal protection, because you'll be in a precarious, flexible work arrangement. But counterintuitively, legally, the less likely you are to be protected. So somebody like you and me, who are in permanent, tenured, open-ended relationships, legally would enjoy all these protections, where somebody who works for a gig economy platform or on a precarious zero-hours contract wouldn't have that kind of protection, right? And so this paradox of precarity, again, has been around for at least 10, 20, 30 years. We're now seeing it reach even the very core of the protected categories, right? And so that's suddenly when we start thinking about, okay, what if the employer can no longer control when people work, right? So working time protection is a really good example. It's very clear in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice that the employer has all sorts of duties to record when, working time takes place, has duties to actually actively ensure that workers can take their rest breaks. It's really difficult to think about a world where I work from home, how my employer could possibly make sure that they fulfill their legal duty, that I don't work more than protected hours, or I take my minimum night rest, for example. So I think that those have been the real challenges.
Yeah, but I had Professor Marzal in this series, whom you certainly know, and we debated on this a little bit. And he said, actually, there's no real problem here because there's a fundamental in the contract, which is trust, and the employer can simply trust that the employee puts the right hours into in the timesheet, and that's the solution, right? Would you agree with this?
Well, I mean, far would it be from me for disagreeing with colleague Marzal. I think it very much depends on the kind of relationship. I mean, I think what we are seeing empirically is that lots of employers don't trust their workers, right? I think, perhaps the single biggest shift we saw as a result of this pandemic for homework and for people in white-collar jobs is the extent of electronic surveillance we now see, right? I mean, it's fascinating when you think back. Imagine, even when I was writing the application for my ERC grant, which looks at algorithmic management and how sort of algorithms manage our working life, when I wrote that grant application in the summer of 2019, algorithmic management was still a fairly small segment of professional white-collar jobs, right? And imagine, even in February, today, a year ago, imagine if the University of Vienna or the University of Oxford would have said to us, by the way, we expect you to start installing a camera in your home. And we will start, expect you to teach from home and record what's going on in your living room. There would have been a massive outcry. There would have been a huge amount of resistance. And so one thing I think that we see sort of overnight is this paradigm shift of, precisely because most employers don't trust their workforce, saying, I now expect you to have a camera switched on all the time. And I expect you to install Microsoft Teams on your home computer. And then therefore, let me see exactly what you're doing, when you're doing, and how you're doing it. Now, that sort of stuff used to exist in the gig economy. And if you were working for a platform like Upwork or Amazon Mechanical Turk, you had to install a plugin that would take screenshots and then you could be monitored. But now suddenly that's come to just about every job that is doing remote work.
But not so much in academia, right? I mean, at least not.
I would disagree with this. So if you look on Twitter, so actually I think he's based in Vienna. So there's Wolfi Christel, who's an Austrian sort of privacy scholar and activist. And he's done some really interesting stuff in terms of Microsoft Teams. So at Oxford University, we use Microsoft Teams to organize a lot of our online teaching. And the amount of snooping and surveillance that can go on of students there is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, the students are a different story, right? I mean, when it comes to exams in particular, that's a very different story from the day-to-day experience, at least at the University of Vienna, I would say. I'm not sure about Oxford, but I would assume that it's quite similar there. So I think, but there's one important point here which you make, which is that we get used that suddenly a camera ends up in our living room, just like in what we are doing at the moment. In some way, the employer expects us to do this and to agree with this. But I'm not that convinced that the surveillance part of your argument is also true, which means that employers really use this to better control what employees are doing. My perception would be, at least in these high-ranked jobs like ours, the employer even gets more freedom not to do this because he already trusts the employee in this, pushing the employee in the way to even more work on the issues in this newly found freedom. Isn't it? Wouldn't that be?
Well, see, what my personal experience is that, I mean, obviously there's a question as to the degree of control that is exercised. You're completely right that there's very little control that can be exercised in academia. However, when it comes to surveillance and data collection, I think there has been a huge shift, right? Because, for example, if I go and, give a lecture, when I start my lecture, when, who I interact with, there's no way of recording that, short of, the dean having a little spy sit in every lecture and take notes. I mean, that's certainly not how it happened here. Whereas now, suddenly, every time you interact with a student through an online platform, a record of that is created.
True, absolutely
right?
true.
And even if the substance isn't recorded, you still have the metadata. So in that sense, I think this is the big change. I mean, I used to joke that, when we here in college signed up for lunch or ordered wine in the evening, it would all be done on a paper form. There was no way of ever tracking that. All of these systems have migrated online. So I think, yes, we might be in a position where they're not used for explicit control purposes, but there's also more subtle ways, right? So another feature that Microsoft Teams has built in is something called Cortana, which we don't have activated, but I know, for example, colleagues at London universities have activated, where every individual worker gets a feedback email in the evening with tips and suggestions to increase their productivity. Right. And they get told, Nicholas, you only send 15 emails to students today. On average, a professor sends 25 emails to students. Why don't you send more emails to students? That sort of thing exists and is being used.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely buy this argument, and it very much brings me to my argument, which is data protection is one of the fields that clearly have become more important or more obvious, I would say. I completely agree with this. But the question then would be whether this is a labor law related phenomenon or whether it's just, the general trend of the crisis that we produce more data, we record more data, and we therefore can use more data as a society. So I'm not that yet. I would like to invite you again to emphasize a little bit more about the labor related part of this. Is there anything specific that needs our attention when we look into this from a labor law point of view, and do we need any reform in that field?
That's a super point. And one, actually, we have a weekly discussion group where this term we're looking specifically at employment, the data protection, and thinking about this. So look, I'm not trying to make a normative claim in what I'm about to say that employment data protection is more important than other areas of data protection. But I think the claim I am happy to make is to say that there are some concerns that are particularly acute in the employment relationship. So I think there's certain elements of general data protection simply don't work, right? So you think about the structure of the employment relationship for the vast majority of workers, the extreme inequality of bargaining power that underpins the contractual arrangement. I think that the amount of control that can be exercised over workers does mean that certain data protection principles, like take consent as an example, simply have to be rethought or at least attenuated in various ways. So I think, yes, absolutely, we are collecting more and more data on everybody and sort of digital breadcrumbs on everybody. But I think the employment context is quite specific in terms of what we can do. And so I think there's an increasing, so, these are debates that go back to the late 1990s with people like Spiros Simitis saying, we need not just an omnibus data protection regime, but we actually need a specific employment work-related data protection regime. And it's even, at least in principle, recognized in Article 88 of the GDPR. But the reality does that actually then play out, I think, is very much the opposite. And in March last year, I without having any data, I would be extremely surprised if the vast majority of employers dutifully conducted a DPIA before they said, you need to switch on your cameras at home right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, but also this consent issue, right? In March, everyone simply turned on his or her video cam and started to work from home, and nobody really cared about whether there was any freely given, informed, blah blah consent given here. And that is probably a mass phenomenon that has already happened in the gig economy for many years, right? So it's in a way bringing gig economy phenomenons into everyone's day-to-day experience, and I'm wondering whether this helps in better understanding the legal deficits and the needs and also the requirements in the gig economy to be transposed into the general aspects of labor market and labor market laws. Would you agree that the understanding has increased here and that the debate has become easier?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think there was often a sense of sort of saying, you know, I shan't name names, but I remember being in Brussels on a panel once and talking about some of the office-based surveillance that you can now do with, you know, companies where you have badges that measure where you're in the office and who you talk to. And next to me sat one of the senior lobbyists of one of the big gig platforms. And afterwards they said to me, I couldn't ever imagine working for a company that uses this kind of technology on their workers. And I said, well, there's a certain irony in that position, isn't there? Because of course there was a sense of like, you know, well, this happens to gig workers, this doesn't happen to us. And I've long been fighting against that dichotomy because yeah, it's a terrible dichotomy. And so, yes, we absolutely see those kind of challenges. I think it then also raises sort of linked point, and that is this danger, and Abi hinted at this, right? So as well, to put it very flippantly, if we can all do your jobs from home, that means your job can be done from anywhere, right? And for a lot of jobs, that then means we can actually take your job, we can split it up into lots of individual tasks, and then we can put them on the internet and have people bid for them, right? Yeah. So I think that also leads to interesting questions. This sort of one thing that we saw in the gig economy was very much a taking off a job, breaking down into individual tasks. And then saying, actually, I'm no longer going to pay you for your overall job. I'm only going to pay you for individual tasks. And in fact, that also means I'm only going to pay you for things that I can actually measure and monitor. And I think that's a trend that's also now coming to workplaces. So to go back to this productivity example, when you get your email in the afternoon saying, you know, how productive you've been today, of course, the notion that you could mathematically measure productivity is pretty crazy for a lot of jobs, right? Because I don't know your experience, Nicholas, but my experience is that actually I'm at my most productive when my computer is switched off and I don't look at my email and I don't speak on the phone, but I sit there and read and think and write. And then the moment I start switching on my computer and have calls and other things, actually I become a lot less productive academically. Yet in terms of what a computer would measure and judge me on, it would be the exact opposite. It's the things that are least productive in terms of thinking and writing that are the things that get measured as productivity.
Yeah, and that's in particular very true for academia, right? And one of the basic problems of academia and monitoring how academics work, in my view, that a lot of what we are doing is not to be put into numbers and figures and to be counted, right? And at the same time, university departments do have an interest in investing their money properly and in measuring what people are doing, and it's very, I mean, this is an ongoing debate, obviously, but probably also true for a lot of other highly skilled jobs, right? Not only for
academia. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the ironies of this crisis is that the gig economy is one of the very few really profiting out of this. So if you look into the reports on 2020 from Facebook or Google or how Amazon, etc., I mean, they really use the crisis well. So isn't that, I mean, how do you look into this then from your point of view? I mean, you have been writing now on this for quite some time, and one of the outcomes is that they do not really do worse but better, which makes it probably more difficult for low-skilled people on the labor market not to end up in a situation where they need to decide on freely give consent to work for one of those. So what to do then from an academic point of view and also from a political point of view when the crisis increases the probability that the risks that you're talking about are unevenly distributed?
Great question. And look, I think it's really important to re-emphasize that I've never been completely against the gig economy, right? There is a camp of people who say, actually, the gig economy is so bad, we should just ban it and it shouldn't exist as a labor market phenomenon. I don't agree with that. I think there is a space in labor markets for the gig economy. What we have to do, on the other hand, and this goes back to this idea of the level playing field, is to say you're not fundamentally distinct from other forms of work. The idea that just because I use an app to tell you when to work and what to do does not mean that therefore labor law doesn't apply. So I think the single most important policy challenge is enforcement. It's all about taking the existing norms and saying, just because you call somebody a rider, that doesn't make her not an employee, right? Just because you use technology doesn't mean that these people are no longer applied. I think enforcement is key here.
And do you see any progress in enforcement since 2018 when you wrote the book?
Yes, absolutely. So what we've started to see is that Supreme Courts all over Europe and indeed globally are starting to recognize that these people are employees. So you look at Paris, for example, big judgment in the Court of Cassation in early 2020. You look at the Court of Appeal here in the UK. We're just waiting for the Supreme Court decision. Most recently, I think in January, in the autumn last year, the Spanish Supreme Court in Globo again found that workers were employees on these platforms. So I think we are starting to see a very clear trend in that direction.
But that is only, is that true only for the Uber drivers, or is it an overall phenomenon for the whole gig economy? So would you give the same?
I think it's a broader.
Yeah.
I think it's a broader phenomenon for the entire gig economy, because I think in a sense, Uber is very often sort of, the canary in the coal mine. Very often it's being used as a test case. But for example, in the Spanish case, it wasn't about Uber drivers. It was about delivery cyclists for a company called Glovo, who are a bit like Foodora or Deliveroo. So I think we're starting to see those trends much more broadly.
Interesting, because I just happened to read today a newspaper article about all these food delivery services and in how far those people are not properly employed, and that one of the outcomes of the crisis is that more and more people work for those, and the market, the labor market as a whole, has become much more competitive for people needing such jobs, so that it has become easier for such companies to find people freely agreeing that they are not properly.
Absolutely. Look, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And in a sense, I think we're starting, I guess it's also the point from which we're starting was extremely aggressive non-compliance, particularly by major platforms, right? Really, really aggressive non-compliance. And I think that's a picture that's slowly changing. But in terms of saying, look, there's now more people who are dependent on these jobs, if anything, that increases the importance of enforcement, right? And I think that increases the importance of saying, from a policy perspective, precisely because you don't want these risks to be just out there for the state ultimately to cover. I mean, somebody has to take the risk in the labor market, right? It's either going to be the employer or the individual, but as the individual can't take it, it's going to get externalized to the state, to all of us, right? If all these people don't pay their taxes and their insurance, well, then all of us are eventually going to pay for their insurance, for their pension, etc. So I think, if anything, the more people are exposed to these kind of risks, the more there is a pressure for us to say, actually, we need to enforce existing norms. We need to ensure there is a level playing field.
Okay, so let's see whether you're right. That is a kind of optimistic view on the situation. But this level playing field, perhaps that would be perhaps a nice last question here. The level playing field is a topic which is not only used in labor law, but it's also used in consumer protection, in telecom, in platform law, and so on. And my guess would be, whenever we talk about the level playing field, something is truly wrong in the market we are talking about, because because the wrongness just triggers this level playing field argument. And it has taken many years until something has become so wrong in the market that somebody comes up with this level playing field, so that the law is always too late and comes in a scenario where already the society or the technological environment has developed so intensively that nothing fundamental will change. And one example for this would be the enormous success of the platforms in this crisis at the moment. Would you agree with this? So 2 questions here. The first one is level playing field, not only in labor law, question mark. 2, argument of level playing field as an indicator that something is really truly wrong and the law comes too late, question mark.
Let's go to your second question first, and let's actually split it up into 2 bits. So I love the idea that the level playing field comes in when things are really wrong. The thing I disagree with you, and this could just be the naivete of youth, the thing I still would disagree with you is that it's too late to then do anything about it, right? So again, I think another big realization here, and this is also worth saying, the vast majority of employers I work with and come across are not actually interested in fake classifying their workers, in exploiting various precarious labor relationships, right? So I think that's also a really important role to say that it's existing employers who are also to some extent getting hugely undercut by this, right? And so I think there's this broader realization that in terms of pushing back, it's not just a question of worker protection. There's a broader coalition we can have here to re-level the playing field. But when it comes to your original point, is the fact that we even have to talk about the level playing field an indication that things are terribly wrong? Yes, I'd agree. And that's a sort of, maybe to conclude, that's a puzzle, particularly at the European level, I've long been thinking about, is that somehow the enforcement of employment law norms seems to be much weaker compared to other things, right? So you compare environmental law, say, with employment law, and if you think about what's the risk of breaching some of my employees' rights or pouring some poisonous toxic stuff down a river, when you think about the enforcement and the penalties, for some reason environmental law is much more strictly enforced than would be labor law by comparison. And so I think there's a real challenge there as well, how we take different elements of the regulatory hierarchy and then have very, very different proofs, right? I mean, even think about data protection, the possible maximum fines for breaching the GDPR, and compare them with possible maximum fines for breaching equality legislation. And, you can then ask yourself, is that really the underlying normativity and the sort of hierarchy of norms that we would intuitively subscribe to?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's plenty of work to do for you in the next years, Jeremias. I'm quite sure about this. And I'm very, very much looking forward to reading about the outcomes of your ESC grant and all the other papers that you are writing on at the moment. What is the next big book project that you are on at the moment? What do you know? So, would you like to share already something about that? And if so,
yes, in fact, I'm just doing the proofs for it.
Okay.
So it's very imminent. I was one little lockdown project, and perhaps also a sort of a Brexit soothing project. A colleague of mine here in Oxford, Sanja Bogojevic, and I, we've written a little book called Great Debates in EU Law. And we've actually tried to write a contextual analysis of different debates of EU law. Where we try and take the reader through a lot of the broader sort of socioeconomic background to the evolution of union law and how that explains a lot of the big debates that we see in union law.
Okay, and is there a chapter on COVID in it already, or was it?
There is the concluding chapter. So we have a concluding chapter where we think about how the tensions we show up in the book. So we show a couple of tensions in EU law. Like the difference between enabling the union and restraining it. And in the concluding chapter, we think about 3 particular challenges. And the 3 challenges going forward, we think about is COVID, is digitalization, and is the various rule of law debates that we've also been seeing, particularly in the context of member states like Hungary or Poland.
Yes. Okay. So this is right in the heart then of this little podcast here. I'm very much looking forward to this, and I hope that I may invite you again when it's out to discuss this with you. Then again, thank you so much, Jeremias, for your time. Thank you so much, Abi, who needed to leave us unfortunately some minutes ago. So this is the reason why you don't see her. She did not. There's no technical problem now. This was planned. Thank you to our listeners. My apologies for the technical glitches at the beginning, but I think we finally made it quite well. Jeremias, my pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Take care and stay healthy.
Thank you very much indeed for hosting us.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so we are offline.